You can imagine what Mary must have been thinking. How could this be God's call on her life when nothing seems to be working out right? Well, God gave her the encouragement. The shepherds come, and the shepherds say, "We saw angels. We heard this remarkable story." And they came not just simply to observe a baby in a manger, an unusual sight, but to worship this child. As we continue to draw near to the Advent season, I've been reflecting more and more on various characters that took part in that first nativity 2,000 years ago. And in particular, I've been thinking about Mary. And within Protestantism, we sometimes neglect reflecting on the role that Mary plays in this story. She truly is a remarkable individual. And what got me really thinking about the role of Mary was I've been reading through this great collection of poetry put together by Malcolm Guite called Waiting on the Word. And it's a poem a day for Advent. So I've been reading every day since Advent Sunday. I've been reading a poem, and Malcolm provides a beautiful commentary explaining and applying what the poet is exploring. And in one of the poems, this is a poem by John Donne, but in Malcolm's explanation, he says this, talking about Mary. He says, in another way, Mary is the archetype of every Christian soul and of the whole church. We are all in some way called to respond to God's promise, to say, "Be it unto me according to thy will," to treasure his words and the gift of his Spirit in our hearts, and in some way, even in the intimacy of our own flesh and daily lives, to bear him into the world. And so I really appreciate what Malcolm had to say about the role of Mary and what she means to us as an example. And indeed, we can look at her as an example of the kind of response that we as Christians ought to have when God brings the call into our life to bring Christ to the world around us. In my own book of poems, Undiminished Returns, there's a section where I'm writing about the coming of Christ into the world. And part of my account of Christ entering the world is a poem on Mary. And in my poem, what I do is I compare and contrast Mary to Eve, the first woman, and how Eve had a call placed on her life, and she chose one path, whereas centuries, millennia later, Mary is faced with a choice, and she chooses a different path. So this poem is called Mary. Mary had a choice. Be it done to me. There's always a choice. Deny, forget, run away, stay, obey. Options are many, even from the beginning. Avoid one tree, eat not its fruit. Choose any other, delights of every kind. So she chose to reach out, not look up, the mother of all living. She chose thorns, not a rose, but the favored one. She wondered with fear, while hiding so much in her heart. Nothing is impossible with God. Her call clear, Mary chose to receive what God would bring. Seed to branch, crown to thorns, and the bloom that dies. Mary's fragrant rose would also arise. Later in my book, I wrote another poem about Mary from her perspective. The mother. So much mystery, yet so much misery. Fear of shaming, divorce, death. A woman with child conceived of God? What blasphemy! Thoughts of betrayal and tears of a good man. Making matters worse, the census and journey, the weight of God in my belly and on my heart. Weary and wondering what the angel meant for me, for us. What will be our part? No room in the world where my baby could be born, yet shooting pain the need to push. With blood and water, my child has come to do good. As I wrapped him, they came in, with an inrush of pungent smells, wafts of outside, sweat, wool. Angels, we heard, peace, joy. My heart is full. As we reflect on Mary's experience, although it was unique and special in the grand history, the grand narrative that God has laid out for us, in a way, calling back what Malcolm said, is Mary is in many ways an archetype for us. The way in which she obeyed, the willingness she followed this incredible call, and it wasn't an easy call. It was a difficult and challenging call, as we heard in my own poem here. The fear of divorce, the fear of shame, the fear of death, being put to death for blasphemy, and breaking Joseph's heart, and then being called on the census and having to go 100 miles over difficult terrain to Bethlehem, and then finding no room but a barn or a manger to give birth to this child. You can imagine what Mary must have been thinking. How could this be God's call on her life when nothing seems to be working out right? Well, God gave her the encouragement. The shepherds come, and the shepherds say, we saw angels. We heard this remarkable story. And they came not just simply to observe a baby in a manger, an unusual sight, but to worship this child. And then, of course, a few years later, the Magi come, the wise men come as well, bringing these remarkable gifts. And maybe at that point in Mary's life, she was beginning to doubt when the burdens and challenges of child rearing has come into play, and she's struggling to make sense of, again, God's call in her life, and God provided that reassurance that her call is true and that her child was indeed special. And so look for those moments in your own life. Yes, there'll be times when things aren't going to work out, when things are challenging for you, but you stay the course. God will be faithful. God will achieve his great ends. And indeed, these moments probably prepared Mary for the time when she was standing at the foot of the cross, seeing her very son crucified and dying, and then looking down at his beloved disciple John and saying, "This is your mother, this is your son." It's a beautiful portrait of faith in difficult times. It's going to get difficult. Life is full of challenges. Nowhere does the Christian call say that you'll be free from hardship. When you look at countless examples of the prophets, of Moses, of Abram, right into the New Testament, the Apostle Paul being beaten and stoned and thrown in prison, and then, of course, Mary and Joseph. The Christian call is not an easy life. It's not an easy call, but it is a blessed one. God is with you. God is faithful, and he indeed works all things together for good for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose.